Hi, my name is Steve Stone. This is Mark Kenny. We're members of the Portsmouth Historical Society, and we are going to interview Jim Garman tonight for a time capsule episode.
Hey Jim, thanks for meeting with us today. I understand you've been an author, a teacher, historian, photographer, very interesting background. Can you tell us more about your education and experience?
Well, I went to college at Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and studied Civil War history. Then I went to Emory University in Atlanta and got my master's degree in Civil War history, so I saw the Civil War from both sides. Then I came to Newport for the Navy, and I'm still here. That was 1961. Okay, so, yeah, and I've been here since. I've been involved in town history since about 1972, and written 6 books on local history, so it's what I do.
Jim, what were your, after you moved to Portsmouth, what were your initial impressions of the town?
It was a very small town back then. By comparison to today, there weren't as many developments as we have today. But it was a town that had a tremendous amount of history, and I, being a trained historian, and a teacher of history, I just got excited about it somewhere around 1972 or so, and said, I've got to find out more about it. And so I found 2 books. One was written in 1886, and one was written in 1936, but it was only 34 pages. So I said, I think it's time for somebody to write some local history. And that's what got me started, really. My first book came out in '76, and I continued to write books up until 2008, 6 books.
Jim, for folks that are new to the town or maybe just getting started with Portsmouth's history, what are some of the highlights of the town's history?
It's a great deal of variety associated with it. First of all, we have the water and steamboats and ferries and bridges and things like that. We also had a coal mine for almost 100 years in this town that a lot of people don't know much about. We had the Navy off and on in different parts of the town. It's primarily, though, it was traditionally up until World War II, it was a rural agricultural town in which there was a great deal of agricultural activity, and the farm produce was shipped to Providence and elsewhere from Bristol Ferry and other ports, other locations we have in the town, and it was very much involved in agriculture at that time. It's a little less so today, but there is still a lot of agriculture here, actually.
Jim, so you've written 6 books. Can people still buy your books? And can you also talk about your postcard collection?
Okay. I've written 6 books beginning in 1976 and until 2008, and only 2 of those are available. I had an interesting experience the other day. The library wanted to digitize my books. They got a grant to do that. And so I found 5 of them. I couldn't find that I had any of the 6th one. And then I started thinking I couldn't remember what it was. So anyway, I scoured my library. My library is about 3,000 books, and I did find 1 copy. So they're going to digitize, but I want that one back. I got involved. My combination of careers is history and photography. And I was a professional photographer for 21 years, as well as a teacher for 39 years. And not consecutively, some of it overlapped, okay. So I started collecting old images, postcards, and photographs. And I remember at one point I had 100 photographs of Portsmouth, old ones. And my interest is mostly in the 1880 to 1930 period, which postcards prevailed very strongly, except during World War I, when there was a paper shortage and they had to stop it for a while. Anyway, I have accumulated over time, as I continued to collect them, somewhere in the vicinity between 3,000 and 3,500 old photographs, including 1,400 of Portsmouth. and all the other towns from Westport to Jamestown. And you might imagine the greatest number of cards that I have is from Newport, simply because Newport was such a tourist center forever. But anyway, I've collected all those, and I have them all in albums. They're very well organized, and I look at them for breakfast. I sit there and read, look at pictures all the time.
Oh, that's wonderful. In terms of learning more about Portsmouth's history, are there certain sites you'd recommend people visit, or websites, books to read?
Well, one thing that's really important and getting greater emphasis now and will continue is the Battle of Rhode Island. We had a Revolutionary War battle fought in this town. A lot of people don't know that. And we have a fort that remains from it, Fort Butts, which is up above the high school, which not that many people have found either. We had a ceremony there back in August, a commemorative ceremony, and we had about 120, 130 people there, which was great. And I talked, and we had another gentleman talk, and we sort of talked about the battle itself. It was fought in 1778, and it was fought in that area between Turkey Hill, Butts Hill, Quaker Hill, and for those who know the local geography, that you know where that was. We had reenactments of the Battle of Rhode Island in 1978 and also in 2003 on the 200th and 250th, you can do the math. Anyway, on anniversaries of the battle, and we're planning one right now for 2028. So the fort, there's a group of volunteers for the fort that have cleaned it up tremendously. It was a mess, and it's really been cleaned up, and I would encourage people to go up and take a look at it. We're having a cleanup session, if anybody's interested, tomorrow from 9 to 1, and we're going to be up there trimming trees and cutting brush and cleaning it up a lot. So we're very actively involved in that, and I get involved in the history of it, obviously, as does Gloria Schmidt. She does a lot of the local history, too. And so we are getting going on that once again, and as I have twice before. So that Revolutionary War battle, which was the largest battle fought in southern New England in August 29th, 1778. It did not result in a victory for the Americans. The Americans tried to push the British off the island. They did not succeed, and the Americans went back to Tiverton and Bristol and other places. So, but it was a significant battle, and something that really deserves much more in the history books than it gets. So that's one really important thing. We had coal mines in Portsmouth, in the area of the Carnegie Abbey Club over there, and the coal mines were here from 1808 until 1912, off and on. And we had a copper works built next to it where they used the coal for copper. The only problem with the coal is it was anthracite coal, and it burned very hot. It could not be used in a home furnace. So therefore, that's why it was off and on. There were about 7 different owners of the coal mine. But the coal mine background is important. It's important to me because my grandfather was a coal miner, not here, but in Pennsylvania. We have that. We have, in my experience, I concentrate a lot on transportation. Trolleys, railroads, steamboats, and ferries. And we had all of those all around here, particularly in the first part of the 20th century. And I spend a lot of time talking about and reading about all those different forms of transportation. That's another aspect here that's very important. So there's just a tremendous amount of history in this town, on this island. It's not all Newport. Portsmouth was founded before Newport. We have to keep reminding people. And I think that the need for history is tremendous. There's a lot of it here. We need more people working on it. We need more people volunteering to get involved in it. The Historical Society is very active. We do a lot. And we have all kinds of different programs and so on there. And I lecture there a lot, and other people do too. So I think that there's a great availability of information about Portsmouth's history. And I encourage people to take greater advantage of it to get involved in it, and there are plenty of opportunities through the Portsmouth Historical Society to get involved.
Can you also talk a little bit about the early beginnings of the town history with the contingent that came down from Boston?
Sure. Portsmouth was founded in 1638. 1638. A lot of people think it's fairly recent as a community. A number of people decided they wanted to leave Boston. Mainly they wanted to leave Boston because of the strictness of the Puritan life there, and the fact that people were restricted and really had limitations on their life, really. And one of the people who was involved, as a lot of people know, was Anne Hutchinson, involved in the fact that she spoke up against the authoritarianism of the Puritans. And she spoke about her interpretation of the Bible, which didn't necessarily follow along with the founding fathers of Massachusetts. So she had two trials, a civilian trial and a religious trial, church trial, and she was excommunicated from the colony. And about that time, some other people were interested in leaving Boston as well, and they were looking for a place. They came across Roger Williams, who had come to Providence a couple of years before, founded Providence. He had been exiled as a Puritan minister from Massachusetts, and he was looking for a place to go, and he ended up founding the settlement of Providence. And he settled it in the wrong place. He was across the river. He was still in Massachusetts, and so he had to settle it again in Providence. So Anne Hutchinson and a lot of her followers and a lot of her coordinators, really people worked with her, talked to Roger Williams and found that they could possibly buy Aquidneck Island from the Native Americans. They negotiated that over some time. They visited the Native Americans down in South County, and they were able to purchase Aquidneck Island for their settlement, again in March of 1638. They signed a compact, an agreement, in which they would work together for a community. They would stay together, which was really important. And this Portsmouth Compact is a document that still exists. It was signed by all the first settlers. It exists. It's in the state archives. And every March, our historical society has it on display at Town Hall. And I talk about that usually there. And that's really a critical piece of paper that was signed in 1638. We have copies of it at the Historical Society, which we sell for if people want a copy of it. So they came here in 1638, and over time, by the way, the Native Americans agreed to evacuate the island. They didn't stay on the island. And so they settled here in Portsmouth, but some of the people who came were merchants from Boston, and they decided they wanted to get involved in trade, in international trade. And so they decided to move further south to Newport and settle Newport in 1639. So 9 people went to Newport and started a settlement there. So Portsmouth remained part of the colony of Rhode Island, along with Portsmouth, Newport, Providence, obviously, and Warwick. They were the 4 settlements. But it was, as you can imagine, geographically, it was a settlement that was all spread out. Communication by rowboat, mostly. So, and that was the beginning of the settlement of Rhode Island. And so that was in the 17th century. And so things went on from there. Anne Hutchinson moved from Portsmouth after her husband died. She went out to New York. And sadly, she and her family were massacred by Indians, Native Americans in New York. And except for one daughter who was out picking berries, and she survived, was picked up by the Native Americans for a while, but then she was free. She got her freedom and went back to Boston, and that's the settlement of all the descendants of Anne Hutchinson, and there's lots of them who are still around and who come to our museum every once in a while. So that's the early settlement as far as Portsmouth is concerned. It has a long history. I mean, we're coming up on 400 years of history in this town, and there is a consciousness of it. It's probably not enough. It probably never would be enough, but it's really a special place.
Let's see. I have a question. The Mott House used to be on West Main Road. Did you ever get the opportunity to tour that before it was disassembled?
No, I didn't. That's when I was just getting involved in the Historical Society. It's interesting that you asked that question. I got an inquiry about it today. Our Historical Society got an inquiry today about people from a family who worked on the Mott Farm and want to know more about it. And I have a big file on it. I have to dig it out to show them. But the Mott Farm was over on the West Main Road, south of the Abbey, south of St. Philomena's. And it was a big farm. It was one of the earliest farms in the town. It was a location for the town meetings for the first few years. Jacob Mott was the owner of it. It was a farmhouse that stood there for a lot of years. And around 1970 or so, it was sold to a man from East Greenwich who was going to disassemble it and then reassemble it back in over in East Greenwich. He loaded it into a trailer truck, took it to East Greenwich, and it rotted. He never put it together. But it was about a 16, I think, I'm not sure the exact date, probably around 1660 or so farmhouse that had many additions put onto it. And it just disintegrated, and of course, that whole area is another housing development in Portsmouth today. Just just north of Melville.
Wow.
Well, Jim, you've given many wonderful lectures at the Historical Society. Most recently, Steve and I enjoyed your lecture on hurricanes. Can you talk to some of the storms that have impacted Rhode Island?
We've had a lot of hurricanes, and the ones of greatest, I don't know, interest isn't the right word. Most people are more aware of 1938 and 1954, although we had one in 1991, Hurricane Bob. But the 38 and the 54 hurricanes really devastated the island. In 38, the damage was incredible. There was a 12-foot wall of water generated by the storm that came up the Sakonnet River and landed on Island Park. And some houses in Island Park were pushed all the way across the land, as far over to where the Montauk Country Club is. 18 people died in the 38 hurricane. They didn't name them back then, by the way. The 38 hurricane. So it was a really devastating storm for all of southern New England and Long Island as well. Very damaging. I think something like 450, 500 people died in that hurricane. And then it continued on up north through by the Cape and up into Maine. In 54, we had Hurricane Gloria, which was really a devastating one as well. Not as bad as 38, but bad. Not as nearly as many people died in 54 that had died in 38. But it still, the damage was incredible. And what happened then and what happens now is that people are still building closer and closer to the water. And the prospect of significant financial damage is greater now than it was even in those two storms. So those hurricanes were really bad. I gave a lecture on those hurricanes at the museum about a month ago, and it's being circulated now, so you can still see it. Anyway, those are the really bad ones. Although we had a hurricane in the middle of the Battle of Rhode Island in 1778, where the troops were out in the fields under tents. Those that could afford to have tents with them, and that hurricane devastated Portsmouth as well. And what happened as a result of that was a lot of those troops that were lined up, and they had about 6,000 American troops here. About 2,000 of those decided their enlistment was up and they were going home, and they went home. So the 1778 hurricane was really a devastating effect on the Battle of Rhode Island, because also the French fleet was beaten up by it. And the French, instead of coming to help support the Americans in the first Franco-American effort, the French fleet went for repairs to Boston, and they took their troops with them. And so they missed the battle. Lafayette was given the responsibility of riding to Boston to encourage them to come back. They didn't come back. And he came back in time to supervise the withdrawal across the Sakonnet River to Tiverton. So that's tied in with storms too.
Interesting. Let's see. That was all the questions that I had. Mark, do you have anything
Yeah, I do
else?
have one follow-on. I always enjoy walking around Glen Farm, Glen Manor. I think we recently celebrated its 100th anniversary, and you also gave a lecture at the Manor. Can you tell us some of the key takeaways from that site?
One of the things that we had in Portsmouth were what are referred to as gentleman farms. And gentleman farms in the south end of Portsmouth were very significant in the early 20th century. We had Glen Farm, we had Sandy Point Farm, we had Oakland Farm, and we had others that were here. And I did a book on all of them a few years ago. And the thing is that they were farms that were owned by people who lived mostly in New York, summered here, summered in Newport, and decided they wanted to get out of Newport and have a farm. So people like Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt and William Vanderbilt and Reginald Vanderbilt and the Taylor family at the Glen all built these huge farms, horse-raising farms mostly, although Sandy Point raised everything from dogs to cows to everything. And so those farms occupied a big chunk of southern Portsmouth back in the early 20th century. The wealth that was exemplified by those, a lot of it took a big hit in the early 20th century because of one institution by the United States government, and that was the income tax. And so a lot of them fell apart, became housing developments and things like that over time. Reginald Vanderbilt ran Sandy Point Farm, and he died in 1925, but his farm was sold after that. Reginald Vanderbilt was the father of Gloria Vanderbilt, the grandfather of Anderson Cooper, who wrote a book about the Vanderbilt family, about his grandfather. The Vanderbilts in Oakland Farm, Alfred Gwynn Vanderbilt died on the Titanic. Correction, he died on the, oh God.
Was it the Lusitania?
The Lusitania. Sorry. His son, William H., inherited Oakland Farm, but William H. was in the minority. He was like 17 or so. He then eventually took over the farm, and it was a really big operation in the 20s and 30s. And William H. was elected governor of the state of Rhode Island in 1938 and served one term, and then he went into the Navy during World War II, and when he came out of the Navy, he sold Oakland Farm. And it was later, as we all know, divided up into house lots as well. Sandy Point Farm with Reginald remained a farm until about 1962 or 3, when it was purchased and divided into house lots. And one section, 4 house lots and the barn, are now for sale. And so that's in the works. Hopefully they'll find a buyer who will want to keep the horse barn there. As far as the Glen was concerned, the Taylor family sort of began to fade out of the Glen in the late 20s, early 30s. And Mrs. Taylor kept going and kept the farm up until she died in 1961. And but the Glen, we were very fortunate. There was a great interest in the town to preserve it. And a lot of that interest was for soccer fields and things like that. And a bunch of people were, the town wanted the school that's there. And so the school committee pushed hard to save the Glen Farm so they could save the school. Then the school committee, when that succeeded through a referendum, when that succeeded, they turned to the public and said, what are we going to do with the manor house? And the pressure from a couple of councilmen was tear it down. Well, a few friends of mine, Richard Cosimini and Barbara Kearney, got involved in that, and they dragged me into it and a few other people back in 1972, and we saved the manor house and saved it as a wedding venue or a public meeting venue and things like that, and we were very fortunate to keep it. And it's a town-operated, a town-owned property now. It's operated by a private person, but saving Glen Farm, and when you drive down through the Glen, you see those athletic fields and everything that are there, and you go to almost any other town around here, and they'll have one soccer field here and one there and one over here someplace. We have everything together right there in one place, and hopefully it's enough for the town. I mean, it's a lot of land, and it's a great treasure. I could name him, but I won't. There was one town councilman who said it should be divided into half-acre house lots. Fortunately, he didn't succeed in getting that opinion. So the salvation of the Glen is really special. It would be nice if we could have been able to save Sandy Point and Oakland as well. And there were other gentleman farms too in the town. It was really a big horse area, and the county fair was really a big deal where people got involved in those things. So, in general, the town has done well. The population of the town has enlarged considerably. A friend of mine in Newport says that in another 10 years, Portsmouth's going to have more people than Newport. And that's a little bit scary. I don't know. Anyway, we have a great town here, and I'm obviously, as you might be able to tell, a big fan of it. And I think that we should be very proud of what we have here in Portsmouth.
We do have a great town. We have a great town historian. Thanks so much for talking with us this morning. I also want to thank Rich Talipsky and Brian Medeiros for taping the show today. Steve, always a pleasure to work with you.
You also, Mark. Thank you. Thank you, Jim, for appearing.
Thank you,
Jim.
Hi.
I also want to thank the audience for joining us today on Time Capsule. This will be one of a series, so we look forward to future interviews. Thank you.